Hey, Missy, I see David's on the call. Dave
Hi,
Lopez.
David.
He's also a church planner in Miami.
Nice to meet you.
And
You too.
he's the original catalyst for Made to Flourish here in Miami. So he actually
Mm-hmm.
brought myself and Carlos on board. David was also the first pastor in Miami to be trained with Redeemer City to City. Trained the trainer. Actually, it was kind of special. Actually, John and Mark came down to the Keys and did a whole training with our people, and so David got to be a part of that, and so he's been a part of our city to city journey since the beginning. So we want to respect your time. Thank you. We talked about the tool. We looked at the tool. I even showed the tool briefly to our board. And they were, Juan was there in our board meeting yesterday and they were very excited for it. And so, we are yours for the next 45 minutes, and feel free to just share what you want to share. And I'm sure these guys will have some questions. And
sure. Okay. Can y'all see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, I'm not going to put it in presenter view because then I can't see your faces.
Sure.
So I'd love to try to, as long as that's big enough for you, I'd love to try to see both. So honestly, the way this came about was very iterative. It didn't come about, I didn't sit down and say, oh, let's sit down and talk about what we can do to help people with COVID. What happened was somebody called me and said, we'd like you to be on a podcast talking about faith and work in light of COVID. I was like, oh, I haven't thought about that yet. And they said, well, you're the faith and work head, so you better think about it fast. We're talking about it tomorrow. So I'm like, okay, I got it. So when I started thinking of podcast, I felt very worried about what I would say, because I thought if I say this about work, it's really going to offend the people, like the nurses who are like, have never had so much work in their life and they're working so hard and they feel like they're totally just freaking out. They have so much work and they're so nervous about it. So if I'm talking about all the people getting laid off, that completely alienates the people whose business has gone through the roof. But if I talk about the business has gone through the roof, that's very alienating to the people whose businesses are closed. So I started trying to think about what is the framework where it's one hope of the gospel, and the hope of the gospel is the same no matter what. So what is the framework that I can try to capture the nuance of everything going on that would capture that? So that's how the tool was born. And then I started, once when I kind of came up with the concept, I kind of shopped it around to a few different people that are pastors dealing with different socioeconomic kind of groupings, as well as different contexts. So I shared it in Europe, I shared it in Phoenix, I shared it in New York, just trying to get some different points of view on did it make sense. So basically what's evolved now is a tool that'll help churches and ministry leaders plan pastoral care for those who have experienced the work disruption. And honestly, I think a marketplace leader that thinks like that feels a very pastoral role in their job, I think it will help them too if they have less people in their work changing roles. So this is really a bit of a, we know that COVID-19 is radically impacting work environments. We know that many pastors are unsure how to pastor the complexity of the work disruption. We know that the disruption highlights varying spiritual and physical needs, as well as temptations. And what we've come up with is we think that how economically flexible and how much sense of agency one has in their job and the type work disruption are kind of two of the factors that impact what their spiritual needs are. We know that the hope is a gospel lateral, but we hope this tool can help people apply it differently to the varying needs. And that if the hope of the gospel penetrates their hearts, no matter where you are in your work disruption, perhaps you can have an outward orientation to be the body of Christ to others in other situations. Yeah, so I'll share with you the model. And then once you figure out where someone falls on the model, you can start to understand what you think their physical needs, their spiritual needs, and their temptations might be, that then can help you nuance the hope of the gospel for those particular needs that can hopefully lead to an outpouring of love. And you can do this on an individual level. So, you know, John Smith, this is John Smith's journey. But then I think you can also do it on a congregational level, which is understanding most of our congregations fall in this most of my congregation falls in this one quadrant, but we seem to be moving down and to the left. So you can think about your congregation and what their needs might be. And so the model basically accounts for these factors. So the x-axis down here refers to the day-to-day work that someone does on a normal work day before COVID. And so it's referring to the level of change being experienced. And so on this side, the day-to-day work model would be the same, but the demand would be radically up. So if you think about maybe the line manufacturing workers at the mask plant, or trying to get out as many masks as possible. So it's the same job, it's just a lot more of it. Now on this side, the work has been completely halted. So this would be a restaurant is closed. The work has totally gone away. And so what it leads to is an upending and strategizing of what can I do to get my revenues now? And then of course there's all in between. This would be kind of the upending area. And so the y-axis refers to a combination of the amount of socioeconomic margin one has in a sustenance lifestyle and or the amount of power or decision-making agency one has in the work environment given their position, education, social capital, etc. So it's a bit of a combination that gives you some sense of power and control. And so this would be obviously your high on the agency and socioeconomic. This would be your low on the agency and socioeconomic. And so the next page starts to help you think about where people might fall. And some people get offended on this next page because they're like, oh my goodness, you're trying to plot people's pain. But I'm not trying to plot people's pain. I'm trying to help people understand how to perhaps help people. And so what we realized, and this is where I got some other pastors really involved to kind of pressure test it and see if it made sense. So if your demand has gone way up and you are in a high socioeconomic agency, you're over here. So examples might be you're the management of Zoom. I mean, you're going through the roof. Your business is going through the roof. You're the grocery chain management. People are waiting outside your doors to get in line and buy your groceries. You are overwhelmed and trying to keep up. Interestingly, I thought hospital administrators would belong in here, but I learned recently, because I thought, okay, they're still having pretty much the same business, just a lot more of it. But it turns out when they had to cancel all their elective surgeries and all that, they've had to rethink their whole economics because that's how they made their money. So they actually are over here, which is our next one, which is your work has either been halted or it's radically upended somewhere in here, and you're trying to re-strategize with an unclear path. So a restaurant owner, their doors are shut. They're like, okay, what are we gonna do? So we've got people delivering margaritas around town, people making family meals, taking them to people, teachers trying to figure out, okay, how do I change all my lessons plans to Zoom? I've been talking to someone who works for Lufthansa Airlines, and they're just radically rethinking how they do things with all this drop in demand. And so these arrows represent that you're not always in one box, right? This disruption, even someone, the first week, the hospital administrators were over here. Well, now they're moving over here because they've had to cancel all their elective surgeries. So part of their routine model has been halted or radically upended. These people here, they're getting pretty scared that they're moving down here. So the restaurant owners, the day their doors shut, they started moving down this curve. They're trying to strategize so they don't move too far down it. So if you get down here, the people whose work was halted and they're on the low margins, they're impoverished and they're trying to survive. So if you think when the restaurants closed, the dishwashers all got laid off. They probably had very little margin anyway. The hotel cleaning staff, they've all been laid off. And they didn't have any margin anyway. And so these blanks represent that these are just examples. You could come up with all kinds of other examples in your own context. These people over here, so their demand is ignited, but they're on the low margin side, low agency, low socioeconomic margin. So these people are exploited and they're trying to progress. So we saw the delivery worker walk out a week or so ago because they're being overworked to Amazon delivery people and the grocery store delivery people. They weren't feeling that they were being protected enough from the virus. And so there's an exploitation, and these people are just trying to progress. They're just trying to work, make their money, move along, progress, but they're feeling exploited, asked to work a lot of hours, asked to work in unsafe conditions. And so if you start to think about individuals or congregations, so you can think about, you know, Maria Smith. You can think, okay, Maria Smith works for Lufthansa in management. And so she's up here, but she's moving over here pretty quickly. And she's really starting to move down here. You can think of someone here that's like the line manufacturing manager. He's done amazing. He ends up getting promoted up into management through this crisis. So you could envision someone moving up through this crisis. It's also very likely that someone from over here could get laid off and go flying over here. Someone down here can go flying down here. So it's just to show that there's movement. And what's really helpful is to start to think about congregations might kind of specialize in one area. So you might have a congregation that's full of this, and now maybe these people are slowly moving over here, and some of them starting to move, and some of them starting to move down here. And so if you understand where they are or where they're moving, you can start to think about what might their spiritual needs be. I want to be careful about assuming spiritual needs onto people, but what might be going on with them? What might be good questions for me to ask around? And so these people that are exhausted and trying to keep up, really what we might need to be helping them with is avoiding on self-reliance and this whole I am God mentality. I mean, can you imagine Dr. Fauci right now? My goodness, Dr. Fauci feels like the entire country's survival is on him, right? You can start to feel a sense of you are God. Anxiety relief, there's probably no Sabbath. And there's probably, maybe not right at the pain point, but there's probably some idolatry examination to go on at some point. These people are scared of moving over here. And over here, the strategizing with unclear path, what they probably most need to know, I'll tell you what, I'm in this box right now. And what I'm feeling is in yellow, this feeling of I'm okay if I fail. We're kind of re-envisioning what is city to city if we have a significantly changed revenue stream off of donations. And I'm on a strategic plan looking at that, right? And I feel pretty uncomfortable, but so I'm strategizing with an unclear path. I need to know I'm okay if I fail. I need anxiety relief. I might need Sabbath. And there's some idolatry examination there too, because these people are starting to feel like, uh-oh, if this doesn't go well, with my identity completely tied to my work. So if you think about a restaurant owner, they're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to lose it. I'm going to lose this restaurant. I've spent 25 years on this restaurant. I'm going to lose this restaurant. I am this restaurant. What am I without this restaurant? And all the anxiety around those issues that then turn into more provisional anxiety if they move down here. So if you get down here, for impoverished and trying to survive, you really need to believe God cares about your well-being. You need to believe that God sees you. You need to believe that God is sovereign, and you have anxiety too, a lot of anxiety everywhere. And over here, exploited and trying to progress, you need to believe that God is just. You're feeling a lot of injustice. You need anxiety relief and Sabbath as well. You need to believe that you're seen. And then I would say everybody is experiencing some kind of fear. So these people are scared of moving here, or these people are scared of moving here. These people are scared of moving here. These people are scared of moving here. And these people are scared that if they stay here too long, they are not going to make it because of physical needs. And so down here, we have the physical needs of food and shelter. food and shelter. And then these, you need energy, rest, probably childcare. You've probably lost your childcare, and you're probably needing to go to work if you're in these boxes. Maybe you're working from home, but then you're trying to juggle your homeschooling and your work. And then these sides also are being exposed to the virus, most likely. Maybe not, but most likely. And so they may need health. And so if you start to think about what the spiritual needs and the physical needs are, you can then start to think about, well, what kind of temptations or kind of functional atheism does that bring up in them, right? So they're gonna, what are they, even though they say they believe, what might they not be believing on that day? And so some of the temptations here around believing that they are God, therefore God's not God if I'm God. They might be tempted to start using people transactionally for success. They're so busy. People are just a raw ingredient. Turn up the volume, work more. If things are going well, they might experience a lot of pride and or greed. If you go over here, again, it's self-reliance on, I've got to figure this out. I got to double down. Again, using people transactionally for success. So, okay, wait staff, work longer, deliver. Now you need to deliver, and I'm going to pay you a whole lot less, right? To try to keep the thing going. They might experience pride if they get it worked out, or despair if they start moving this way and further this way. Perhaps greed. These folks they have a temptation to just give up on God, total despair, extreme cynicism. There's potential for abuse from this quadrant to this quadrant, and from this quadrant to this quadrant. And then there's potential disdain, really between these two quadrants the most, but really between anyone down here and up here, or up here to down there, some disdain for each other. So then if you pull it all together, you can start to say, okay, what is the hope of the gospel for that quadrant? And so for the exhausted and trying to keep up, that God is in charge, that we're working for Christ, not man, that God prepared the work before you as an image bearer, and probably some idolatry examination as well. But I didn't really put that on the hope, because that's not necessarily the hope, except that understanding your brokenness helps you remember that God is in charge, and also sees you see the broken below in the quadrants below you. And over here, if you're strategizing with an unclear path, you start to need to hear that God is on his throne, that he didn't stop, this chaos is okay. He's still on the throne, that Jesus is drawing us to him in failure, and that our righteousness is not through our works, and not doing a good job, and not by our success, and not by our approval of our boss, and not by if the restaurant succeeds. Our righteousness is through our relationship with Christ. And down here, that we're heirs to his glory in full, that he makes good from suffering, that we serve a suffering Savior, that he felt forsaken, he felt not seen, he felt left alone, and that he is our refuge. One of the pastors I've been working with in a different class was talking about his dad has owned a dry cleaner for 45 years, and he's lived, kind of hand to mouth, paycheck in, paycheck out for 45 years, no savings, no nothing. And his dry cleaner's been closed. And so he's just going, woo, he's just sliding right on down really, 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 really fast. And he's in his 60s and he has no retirement. And he was talking about his dad was such an unbelievable example of Psalm 31. He said his dad has zero anxiety. His dad completely has the hope of the gospel in his heart. And he's like, God will provide. I will worry about today. I'll worry about tomorrow. Pretty amazing. Then over here, these exploited ones, they really need to know some of these suffering things as well, but they need to see that God cares about justice. And they need to see that in the new heaven and the new earth, all things become untrue, all sad things become untrue. So what we can move in a moment towards then moving outwards towards the love, posture of love, but what I've kind of just thrown it all at you. Do you all want to stop and discuss or ask questions or?
Why did you get some initial pushback when you were trying to label people's pain?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just,
You
it
know,
sounds like it's a grid to just kind of give us some handles, right?
I mean, that was my thought. It's interesting. All the pushback I've gotten is from people in these two grids, and they were all pushing back. They were saying they were pushing back on behalf of this grid, these quadrants, but I think that they were, but I think they were just like, oh, don't put me in a box, don't put me in a box. Because all the people that have looked at it from these grids were like, oh my goodness, you see us, thank you for seeing us. So I think these people were worried it might hurt these people's feelings. But these people were saying, you're not hurting my feelings, you're seeing my situation. That's the feedback I've heard so far. I was very worried about these quadrants, and I spent a lot of time with people that work with people in these quadrants, because I said, if this tool has any potential to hurt people in these quadrants, I'm throwing it away. Because if it's a tool that only helps these at the expense of these, we have too many of those. So I spent more time with people who people do boots on the ground ministry with these people to make sure that it wasn't going to be offensive to the most vulnerable. But you could start to work with pastors or even pastoral teams, and I'll show you the workbook pages I've developed in a minute, to start to say, okay, we've typically been working with people up here, and they're moving down this quadrant. And so we need to figure out, are most of our people moving down from here, or are they moving down from here? Because these people might have an I am God syndrome, whereas these people might have a I'm gonna fail syndrome. And you would want to be preaching very different things if you thought most of your people were here versus here. And then if you're preaching a message to this group, but really all your people are now down in this group, you might really whiff.
Let me ask, Missy, if you've got a socioeconomically diverse congregation, how are you encouraging leaders to think about messaging? Because there's 4 unique audiences, at least.
Yeah. You know, I don't know that I've answered that question yet. I don't know that I know the answer. I would love a pastor who's doing that to tell me that. So I did talk with, do you all know Aaron Daly out in Phoenix by chance?
I do.
You do? So Aaron was talking to me about being very careful that you're not mixing the temporary poor with the systemically poor. So that's one caution he gave, because the temporarily poor will have some of the same pastoral needs as the systemically poor, but they'll be able to pop out much more quickly.
That's a confusing statement to me, because I'm going to call Aaron because I want to unpack that with him. Because if you are temporarily poor, that's a systemic issue.
So what he was trying to say is, like, let's say I got laid off and I was a single mother, which I'm not. So let's just pretend. My little sister has her master's in nursing. She is a single mother. If she got laid off, she would be fine for a while, but in about 6 months, she would be in a ton of trouble.
Okay.
But she has a master's degree. She can probably get rehired pretty easily. She has a sister she can call and say, hey, can you help me? She has an ex-husband who is kind and has some affluence and would take care of the kids. And so she has some systemic social capital, educational capital that would allow her to pop out of poverty much more quickly than someone who has been living on the margin for a whole long time due to generational unemployment, a prison record, some systemic issues that might, homelessness, mental illness, that might systemically keep them poor for a long time.
So would you put your sister, let's say we fast forward 6 months to 12 months from now, is this chart going to categorize your sister as low socioeconomic flexibility and agency, or would she be more like medium
That's a great question. Yeah. So she probably never falls all the way down here because of her education, right? But she might fall down here enough to have hard provisional needs of food and shelter. So like if we go back and look at, where's here it is. No, sorry. Okay, so say, let's say she wasn't a nurse because nurses are too easy to get rehired. Let's say that she works in retail. Okay, let's say she works in retail. Let's say she was, you know, kind of right here, and then she starts moving, she loses her job, she starts moving and moving and moving and moving and moving, and she ends up down here. She doesn't have food or shelter, but she has someone she can call on to get help, so she never gets all the way down to here. She has a master's, so she probably can at some point pop back up pretty quickly. You know, she has a good resume, she doesn't have a felony. So I think the issue is that not that their needs are different, but unpack it with Aaron. Also, he did a podcast with me. I can send you the podcast, but it's not that the needs are necessarily different. It's just that a bunch of people are going to fall into this box and pop back out, and the people that live in this box are still going to be in this box.
Yeah.
There are some pastors that all they do is pastor this box, but now a lot of pastors that pastor right around here are going to be pastoring down here.
Question for you, Missy. Can you go back to the other chart that you had on the hope of the gospel? I think it was 12 or something like that, or 11. So I was you know, kind of reading through that, and I guess my question was, what about some of the more like material hopes? You know, I was wondering in terms of, you know, God as our provider, you know, as one who supplies our every need. And I just wondered if that was intentional, you know, if maybe, you know, refraining from some of that, or yeah, I wanted to maybe know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I left blanks on here specifically because I think there are, I probably could have put 10 more in each quadrant.
Yeah.
I stayed away from that one on purpose on the slide, not because I don't believe it's true, but because I was thinking, who am I who is sitting in a house social distancing with internet Wi-Fi, complaining that my kids are using my Wi-Fi band, to say, don't worry, God is our provider. To you know, I sit on a board of a nonprofit here that provides health care to refugees who can't get insurance. And I heard all these stories yesterday about how they're taking all this Advil. It's why the Tyson plant got closed. They're taking all this Advil and going to work with COVID because if they do not get their paycheck, they have nothing. They can't rely on any of the government programs. They can't get back to their country. They have nothing to do because they're refugees and immigrants, and they cannot put food on the table. So they're going to work sick. And so I felt unqualified to write on there, God is our provider, knowing stories like that in this quadrant, that I just, I believe it's true, but I haven't experienced that. And I just didn't know how I would be able to say, don't worry, God's going to provide you. There's manna, read the Old Testament. And they're like, well, where's my manna? I'm hungry. You know, so I just felt uncomfortable. I think it is true. And I think Aaron probably pastors to that all the time. And interestingly, when we talk about the outward love, the love that I saw that this quadrant could give back to the other quadrants is to model what reliance on God instead of self looks like. They're the ultimate model for that, to both of these upper quadrants, which I think is the inverse of what you're saying.
It's great.
Yeah. And so here is we've this is probably the most confusing, ugliest slide. I need to do something about it. But we've created the slide about, so if the gospel penetrates your heart, how can you help your congregants move it out? Move it out. And so if you're mostly with these folks, yes, they're tired. Yes, they're overworked, and maybe they can't do it, you know, go work at the soup kitchen. But can they offer fair treatment to these people down here? Can they be sensitive about what's going on to these people that they are saying, please work double shifts, you know? Can they celebrate the work of the unseen down here? Can they share financially down here? And if you look over here, can they share base level provisions and employment assistance? And maybe all they can do right now is give their money to this stuff. But can they get these people food and sheltered? And can the church help with that? Can the church help lasso these people to get these people food, sheltered, and employment assistance? The other thing these people can do for these people is share strategy. And so they could use their brain power to help these people think strategically. I think these people, even though they're really stressed, they're still high on the margin. They need to share base level provisions and employment sustenance to these people down here too. Then another thing these people down here, they can give community and childcare over here. These people have probably lost all their childcare. Their daycares are closed. They've got to go work at the Tyson plant or wherever they need to work. What if we can get these people giving childcare to these people? And then these people can give encouragement and community back to these people. And so the point is that I think that we always think a lot about these quadrants just giving money to these quadrants and these poor needy quadrants. But I think these quadrants give gifts back to these other quadrants and showing in this disruption what it looks like to rely on God and what it looks like to be a community. And it gives them the opportunity to share. So the next place we went with it is like, okay, so this is now just a model. How do we help pastors try to use it? So we've made a workbook. The workbook kind of explains the model and then says, okay, I want you to think about as a practitioner, what quadrant are you most comfortable with? Do you have a hidden bias for or against certain groups? How can you prepare for quadrants where your constituents might be moving? What quadrant is your organization set up to serve? Where you have organizational holes for key quadrants? What organizational structures or cultural expressions inhibit ministry to other quadrants? And then think through how can you incorporate into your one-on-one interactions as well as programmatically and in your people leadership. So how do your sermons change? How do your team meetings change? How do your classes change? What about new service offerings? And then how are you mobilizing the body to love? How are you helping think, where are our people? And this is where I think it can be really interesting if you have a socioeconomically diverse church. You could really start trying to think about some people in the upper right and partnering up with some people down in the bottom left. And you can start taking people in the bottom left and seeing if they could do be models of reliance and be testimonies and be in front of the church and like let those people in the top quadrants be like, oh my goodness, why am I so worried? Look at the reliance on provision these people have. And so we made a workbook where you can take your organization and your constituents and you can textualize and think about where are yours, where are they moving? What do you think the physical and spiritual needs are in your exact context? What do you think the temptations are in your exact context? So you can start, there are some cities where image is so important. And so if people over here are starting to move down, they're having their idolatry crisis is about their image, Other cities' image doesn't matter. So you can think about what is it for your congregation or your city context. And then you can think about what is the hope of the gospel that you want to share in your context and the outward love in your context. So start to strategize and think about what can we do differently as our people go through some work change.
So Missy, I have a follow-up question. Have you guys thought at all about some sort of assessment tool So a local church, let's say they have 100 members, a tool that could help the pastors assess where their people are at, either either partnering with Glue or with Barna to do some kind of, give this survey out to your congregation so that they can self-assess, so that then they get the report back so they could see like, oh, this is where my people are at in these quadrants.
That's a great idea. I've not pursued that yet. I had thought about an assessment, but I hadn't thought about going through Glue or Barna. That's a really interesting thought.
Barna,
a good one.
So, and you may be aware of this already, but Glue and Barna partnered together to create this free platform that churches can do surveys now with their people and kind of get a handle on where people are at. This would be so they already have the platform set up.
Got it.
Take this tool and insert it to what they're already doing.
I should definitely. Do you have a good contact there? I know that the CEO of City to City met with them a couple months ago, so I'm sure he could introduce me. But do you have a good working relationship?
Between David and myself, we can put you in touch with someone.
Okay, it's a great idea. I mean, do you all feel like this is like, okay, nice Brainiac tool, but not really that helpful, or do you feel like, oh, this is going to be helpful?
I think it's so helpful, Missy. I think it's a wonderful tool. We actually, worked on a translation for it in Spanish as well.
Oh, you did the translation. Thank you.
David's mom. Yeah. And so,
by the way, that translation,
it's awesome.
We've already sent that to Mexico and Colombia, the translation. Thank you so much for that.
That's so cool. That's all Sophie, David's mom. And so, no, I think it's an amazing tool. I think it's great for teams. I'm like, this is the kind of stuff that I think if you frame it well, maybe adjust a couple of things. You could even, from an application in terms of sermon standpoint, I think it can work as well. Hey, you may be in one of these quadrants, I mean.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
I think it's very practical. Yeah.
That's great. Are there any things that besides an assessment tool, are there things that you think would make it more helpful or more understandable? Or
Missy, one thing I would kind of throw out there, just as I'm hearing you talk, I think we're operating under a few assumptions, right? When we look at the different quadrants, and that's assuming we know who falls into which category.
Right.
Oftentimes pastors tend to operate out of ignorance sometimes because they don't want certain things to influence the way they shepherd or they lead. So my sense is you have to know some amount of information about who's in your church, like who's actually sitting there, because without having a sense of who's there, you don't know who's here, down here. I mean, the lower quadrants tend to be easy to kind of gauge, if you will.
Yeah.
But maybe the upper quadrants are a little bit harder to sense. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, and what I appreciate about this, there isn't a I versus you or we versus them, but rather there's like the whole thing collectively works together. And I think that as you guys unpack the usage of this, if you're working like in a displaced community, it's easy to have a us against the world mentality. And if you're working among, like, I don't know, the wealthy of whatever community, it's easy to feel like, oh, pobrecitos, we'll throw them a bone.
Yeah.
And then there's everybody kind of in between. So I think maybe double clicking on, all right, like it's all or nothing, like the whole thing has to fit. I think that there would be high value there.
That's good. That's helpful. And I think that's what the purpose of this was, to really show that every single quadrant has something to give another quadrant. Like, this is the quadrant the world says is the best quadrant, but this quadrant isn't. Like, this quadrant has like some major issues. This quadrant needs these quadrants. But they don't know they need them. they think the need is one way for the most part. But those are some great ideas. So I think I gave this to Matt Reston at Made to Flourish, and I think he's doing something with it. He asked me to send him a PDF of it, but I'm trying to send him the kind of the video PDF because I think it's hard to go out without an explanation.
I have, one more thought to think through some of what Jesse said. One slide that could be, maybe helpful in terms of assessment, and maybe it's not something super robust, but maybe something that asks, it's just a survey, ask people, hey, do you have a job right now? Do you have A, B, and C? So that can at least help, to David's point as well, place somebody or even us, help the pastor triage the individual and where they stand somewhere in the quadrants,
Yeah, so just like a set of questions for pastor triage questions.
That's right, that's right.
That's a great idea. Okay, I can add that pretty easily.
And I know we're right at
that seems so obvious. Is that not offensive for, like, if I ask the pastor to say, how do you decide what quadrants they're in? Do you have a job? Has the demand in your job gone up? Has the demand gone, does that feel like condescending?
No.
No, okay.
I don't think so. Those are just facts.
Yeah.
I think
it's easier for the low and halted quadrant and the ignited and high quadrant. It would be a little bit more helpful for people that fall in the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, this goes back to the conversation about what Aaron Daly said, to be careful about not confusing the systemic poor versus like the temporarily poor because of the situation. And this is probably a different conversation that we could have. But Missy, I see this tool as an effective tool even beyond COVID.
You're right.
And even thinking about systemically poor communities, this tool could be very helpful, because when you mention the example of your sister, there are aspects of your sister's life that give her socioeconomic flexibility and agency that aren't necessarily as obvious, like a job. The obvious part is like the ex-husband that has affluence that can help with the kids. The fact that she has a sister who's probably going to be willing to help. There's a lot of different factors that go into the same with the systemic poor. There are systemic reasons why they're poor. Born into poverty, not having family that can help them, not having access to good healthcare, not having access to good education. There are these like systemic issues so I don't think, and Aaron and I are good friends. I am going to follow up with him because I would love to understand even futuristically how this tool can help us think about our different communities and how we can, because I think for me, the gold out of this whole thing is this last slide right here. It's the outward love. It's how you can mobilize your congregation to love each other and to love people in our city. So you first have to have an understanding of like, what are those physical and spiritual needs, so that then we can practically like engage. So I don't think we're pitting this up against like a systemic poor kind of a scenario. I think it's both and. I think we just need maybe better, more conversations and clearer vocabulary around what do we mean when we talk about like low income and halted or upended work. What are the issues there? And being able to have handles and be able to unpack that, it could be very helpful in knowing what to actually do.
Well, maybe we could make that like a project in June or July or whenever kind of the COVID stuff. I hope it's by June or July. And talk about how we can kind of repurpose it to be a more ongoing tool. Because I've had a couple of people tell me that, and I think you're right.
Hey, Missy, I've got a little follow-up really quick. So let's say for a second, I'm a pastor watching this in the next day or two or three or something like that. And I walked away going, wow, that was a great presentation. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. Like what would you say, hey, pastor, here's a couple of things that I would encourage you to seriously consider in the next hour, 3 hours, 24 hours.
Yeah. Okay. So I need to add a slide about that. But I would just say sit down with the workbook pages and think through you know, where do you get your other pastors with you, or if you're a small church, you get your discipleship person with you, and sit down and think through your officers, think through kind of your everyday people that you see all the time, and think through, do I know what's going on with their work? Do I know what they do? Do I have any idea? If you don't, well, this is Faith and Work On-Ramp 101. Let's get to know what your people do. Maybe a survey is your first step. Maybe you go over this with your constituents. Maybe you have a meeting with your constituents and you say, we want to explain this to you. Where do you think you all fall? What do you think we should be doing as a body? Maybe get your officers together. But I would say going through the workbook pages with your other ministry leaders that are alongside you would be the best first step for me. So think about yourself. What quadrant do you feel most comfortable with? Like Aaron says, you know, I really like ministering down in this bottom left. That's where I like to minister. My pastor, he likes the top right. Do you have hidden biases against certain ones? Kind of assess yourself so you know that you're going in with your biases. And how can you prepare yourself for quadrants where your constituents might be moving? Look at your organization and look at your programs and whatnot. I think it's a good team exercise.
Really good. Yeah. Well, hey, it's 3:51. Thank you for giving us extra minutes. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Missy. Nice to meet you.
Let me know.